Gonna work out and now end up starting out on a eighth of a mile pull, because we can't cut the pine. And
He built something from nothing in the swamps of North Carolina. For 4 seasons, millions of Americans tuned in every week to watch him drag timber out of terrain that would swallow lesser men whole. Bad weather, broken equipment, impossible deadlines. Bobby Goodson handled all of it on camera without flinching. He became a folk hero to anyone who'd ever worked with their hands and had something to prove. But here's the thing about folk heroes. The cameras only ever catch a fraction of the story. Because what the Discovery Channel never showed you was the man behind the mud. The version of Bobby Goodson who spent years in a darkness so deep he couldn't remember a single day without alcohol or drugs. The version who came within seconds of destroying the one person who had ever truly believed in him. The version who built a 37-year dynasty from the ground up, only to watch economic forces rip it apart in a matter of months. This isn't just a story about logging. It's a story about what a man can lose, what he can rebuild, and what it costs when the world stops cooperating. This is the heartbroken story of Bobby Goodson. Bobby Goodson didn't choose logging. It chose him before he was old enough to have an opinion about it. His grandfather, T.R. Goodson, logged for decades across Florida, South Carolina, and Virginia before finally planting roots in Jacksonville, North Carolina in 1954. His father, Marvin Goodson, carried the tradition forward for 27 years after that, working the timber industry with the kind of quiet devotion that doesn't leave much room for alternatives. By the time Bobby came along, the trade was already in his blood. The only real question was when he'd start, not whether he would. Born in Jacksonville in 1964, Bobby landed his first logging job at just 11 years old, spending an entire summer working alongside his father in the woods. Most kids that age were riding bikes and sleeping in on weekends. Bobby was learning how to read a tree, how to work a machine, and how to push through when every muscle in his body was telling him to stop. It was back-breaking work, and he loved it. At the height of the Goodson family's grip on the local industry, the scope of what they had built was staggering. There were as many as 11 separate Goodson logging businesses running independently across eastern North Carolina. Brothers, uncles, and cousins all working their own operations, hauling their own loads, answering to nobody but themselves. Combined, those crews were putting out between 800 and 1,000 loads a week. The Goodson name wasn't just recognizable in that part of the state, it was synonymous with timber itself. Growing up inside that kind of legacy should have been straightforward. You learn the trade, you respect the work, you carry it forward. And for a while, that was exactly the trajectory Bobby was on. He was sharp, he was capable, and the people around him recognized early that he had something special, a rare combination of instinct and drive that couldn't be taught. His father had it, his grandfather had it before him, and Bobby had it in spades. But growing up fast, surrounded by older men in a hard industry, opened doors that should have stayed shut for a few more years. The logging camps of eastern North Carolina weren't exactly known for sheltered upbringings. Bobby was spending long days around grown men with grown habits, and some of that was bound to leave a mark. He was still a kid, but he was already moving through a world that didn't treat him like one, and that gap between his age and his environment was about to cost him dearly. By the time most kids were figuring out homework and Friday night plans, Bobby Goodson was already deep into a pattern that would define and nearly destroy the next phase of his life. Working the woods from age 11 meant spending time around older men who lived hard and played harder. Bobby fell in with older crowds almost naturally, and the partying started earlier than anyone should be comfortable admitting. By the 5th grade, he was showing up to school drunk, not buzzed, drunk. That detail alone should stop you in your tracks. This wasn't a teenager experimenting at a weekend party. This was a child, barely 10 or 11 years old, already dependent on alcohol to get through an ordinary school day. And the most alarming part wasn't even the drinking itself. It was that nobody intervened. Nobody pulled the emergency brake. Life just kept moving around him, and Bobby kept sinking a little deeper with every passing year. He would later reflect that looking back over his entire youth, he couldn't remember a single day where he wasn't drinking, getting high, or using something to take the edge off reality. Not a single day. That's not a phase, that's not a rough patch. That's a young person who had lost any version of himself that existed without substance abuse holding it together. The substances weren't something he turned to in a crisis. They were the baseline, the floor, the thing that made every other day feel remotely manageable. What made the whole thing so insidious was the environment that surrounded it. In the world Bobby grew up in, this kind of hard living wasn't treated as a crisis. It was almost expected. The logging industry of rural North Carolina in the 70s and 80s was not a world known for conversations about mental health or addiction recovery. You worked, you drank, you showed back up the next morning and did it again. There was no framework for recognizing what was happening to Bobby because the culture around him had quietly normalized it. And so the years passed. Bobby kept working, kept drinking, kept using, and the habit that started in elementary school quietly calcified into something permanent. He was talented, he was driven, he had a legacy to uphold and a family name that carried real weight in that community. But underneath all of it was a version of Bobby Goodson that was running on borrowed time. He just didn't know it yet. What came next would be a collision between that darkness and the one thing he wasn't prepared to lose.
Bobby Goodson had dated plenty of girls by the time he was a teenager. Growing up the way he did, moving in older circles, that wasn't exactly surprising. But at 13 years old, he met someone different. Her name was Lori Mueller, and she wasn't like the rest. Smart, sharp, and just as stubborn as Bobby was, Lori wasn't going to be pushed around, and Bobby, even then, respected that about her. They started dating a year later, and despite everything that followed, they never really stopped. On paper, it sounded like a classic small-town love story. Two kids from Jacksonville, growing up together, building a life. But the reality was a powder keg. Both of them had tempers. Both of them knew exactly where the other's buttons were, and neither had any hesitation about pushing them. Bobby admitted later that when he wanted to hurt Lori, he went straight for the worst possible thing he could say, and Lori, by her own account, could shoot back just as hard. The relationship wasn't just volatile, it was a cycle of escalation that neither of them knew how to break. Then at 16 years old, the dynamic shifted in a way that made everything more complicated. Lori became pregnant, and that November their son Justin was born. Two teenagers, a newborn, and a relationship already running on fumes. They didn't marry immediately, that came 5 years later. But even the wedding itself carried a shadow. Bobby didn't find out until after the ceremony that his own brother had been quietly taking bets on how long the marriage would last. The over-under apparently was a year, and the specific prediction that Bobby would kill her. That's a brutal thing to sit with, a man's own family at his wedding betting on violence rather than longevity. But the people who knew Bobby best weren't making that prediction out of cruelty. They were making it out of fear because they had seen what he was capable of when the drinking took over. And deep down, even Bobby knew they weren't entirely wrong to worry. Still, there was something real between him and Lori. Always had been. Something stubborn and unshakable that refused to let either of them walk away no matter how bad it got. But before that something could mean anything, Bobby was going to have to hit the lowest point of his life, and it was coming fast. For years, the fights had followed the same rhythm. Bobby would come home drunk, things would escalate, chaos would erupt, and by morning the damage was done and Bobby remembered little of how it got there. Doors knocked clean off hinges, holes punched through walls, a house that looked like something had torn through it, and a man standing in the middle of it trying to piece together a night he couldn't account for. It happened enough times that it had almost become routine, almost. Then one night, it went further than it ever had before. Bobby came home drunk, and when Lori tried to wake him, something inside him snapped. He flew into a rage and had her pinned against the wall with both hands around her throat. Lori later described the moment in chilling detail, her head slamming against the wall, the floor coming up to meet her as she fell, the bed breaking beneath her weight when he finally let go. The only reason he let go at all was because the phone rang. Bobby answered it like nothing was happening. Calm voice, normal tone. Lori choked her way through a few words on the extension, barely keeping herself together. The caller was her father. Bobby had almost strangled the life out of her, and 30 seconds later he was making small talk with her dad. Then he fell asleep. The next morning, Bobby woke up and didn't remember any of it. What he found instead was the aftermath, a demolished house, a wife who had barely escaped something unthinkable, and the slow, nauseating realization of what his own hands had almost done. He stood in that wreckage and said later that he knew in that moment he had to change, or it was going to end in a way there was no recovering from. He could have killed Lori. He didn't even know where his son Justin had been while it happened. That thought alone was enough to hollow a man out. He didn't check himself into a program. He didn't call a counselor. He didn't gradually taper off or make a slow, measured plan. What Bobby Goodson did that week was decide, just flat out decide. And the following Sunday, he and Lori walked into a church together, which, given everything, was either the most unlikely ending to that story or the only one that made any sense at all. What happened next would floor everyone who thought they knew Bobby Goodson.
Nobody who had watched Bobby Goodson operate for the previous 2 decades would have predicted what happened next. This was a man who had spent every single day of his adult life dependent on alcohol and drugs. A man whose own family had privately written off his marriage as a countdown. A man who had just come within seconds of doing something he could never take back. And that Sunday, he walked into a church, sat down in a pew, and gave his life to Christ. By his own account, the change was immediate, not gradual, not a slow climb back towards sobriety with setbacks along the way. Immediate, the alcohol, gone. The drugs, gone. The version of Bobby that couldn't function without a chemical buffer between himself and reality simply ceased to exist the moment he made that decision. He said afterward that he left the church that night knowing, without any doubt, that something fundamental had shifted inside him. He'd done the right thing and he could feel it. Lori watched the transformation happen in real time. The following week, she made the same decision in that same building. She later said she didn't need anyone to tell her to give up the drinking or the lifestyle. She just knew. It wasn't reluctant surrender, it was relief. Both of them were baptized, and for the first time in their relationship, they started building something instead of just surviving each other. The marriage that Bobby's brother had bet money would end in homicide was still standing. More than standing, it was being rebuilt from the foundation up. The 2 people who had spent years in a cycle of damage and retaliation were learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to actually be a family. Justin was growing up in a household that looked nothing like the chaos of the early years. Their daughter Brittany came along and grew up in that same rebuilt environment. It would be tempting to tie a neat bow around this part of the story. The troubled man finds faith, everything gets better. But the more honest version is that faith gave Bobby the tools to stop destroying things. What he did with those tools, building a business, raising a family, eventually becoming the face of a nationally broadcast television show that was still all him. The redemption was real, but the work that came after it was equally real, and Bobby Goodson had never been afraid of work. With the darkest chapter of his life finally behind him, Bobby turned his full attention toward building something that would last. He had gone to college after high school, which surprises people who picture him as a man who never left the tree line, and earned a degree in graphic communications from Shawan College. But the rise of computer graphics made that field almost unrecognizable by the time he graduated, and his degree became obsolete faster than he could put it to use. So he went back to his father's side in the woods, learned everything there was to learn, and then in 1986 struck out on his own. Goodson's all-terrain logging was founded that year in Jacksonville, North Carolina. It started as a straightforward operation, but Bobby's ambitions for it were anything but. He had a specific vision for how to work the swamp terrain that surrounded him, terrain that most loggers avoided because it was simply too difficult. In 1996, a full decade after founding the company, he began developing and refining what became known as shovel logging. It was a specialized technique that used excavator-style equipment to extract timber from extreme wetland environments in a way that was both more effective and considerably less damaging to the surrounding ecosystem than traditional methods. It set Goodson's operation apart from everyone else in the region. By the late 2000s, the company had grown to 17 full-time employees. Bobby's son Justin, born a 5th-generation logger whether he liked it or not, had grown up in the woods alongside his father and was now his right-hand man. Justin had gone to Coastal Carolina Community College, earned a degree in diesel mechanics, and by 18 was working full-time for the family operation. Between the 2 of them, there wasn't a piece of equipment on site that couldn't be run, repaired, or coaxed back to life. Then came 2009, and with it an offer that changed everything. Pilgrim Films approached Bobby about a reality series that would give the country a ground-level view of what swamp logging actually looked like. The Discovery Channel launched Swamp Loggers that year, and it became a genuine hit. 4 seasons, filmed largely in Pender County, North Carolina, each one pulling back the curtain on a profession most Americans had never thought twice about. Bobby became a recognizable face in millions of living rooms, and the logging world finally had a spokesperson who could make the brutality of the job feel compelling on screen. But fame doesn't pay for diesel, and the engine driving Goodson's all-terrain logging was about to start sputtering.
Today, of all the Goodson logging businesses that once dominated eastern North Carolina, only one remains: Bobby's older brother Mike, still working the woods with 2 crews under his own name. Bobby has stepped away entirely, but the story isn't over. Justin is still out there, a 5th-generation logger keeping the bloodline alive. Some of Bobby's grandchildren have already shown interest in the trade. The gate may be closed, but the roots are still there. What Bobby Goodson's life adds up to is something that doesn't fit cleanly into any single category. It's not purely a success story. It's not a tragedy. It's the account of a man who came from something, nearly became something terrible, found his way back, built something extraordinary, and then lost it to forces larger than any one man could fight alone. He survived a childhood that should have buried him. He saved a marriage that everyone around him had written off. He built a business that outlasted a television show and almost outlasted him. Almost. Some legacies live in what gets passed down. And Bobby Goodson gave his family something no diesel price or market collapse can ever touch: the proof that a man can change.